you want me to advance it for you? Or would you, I mean, if you can arrange it,
maybe if I start like learning it, and
just nudge me.
yeah, it would be like 3 slides ahead of it.
No, I'm sure.
Que vamos a dar 4 minutitos para que llegue el resto de nuestra audiencia y empezamos 3:15 en punto. Tal vez acortamos un poquito nuestras preguntas.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. Bienvenido. Ahí si quieres. ¿Tú vives aquí? No, vivo en Vermont.
Gracias por su puntualidad. Ya sé que las cuentas salieron tarde en el restaurante. Muchas gracias al panel. Y los dejo para esta segunda mesa con Ana. Ana María va a hacer las presentaciones y después me parece que tenemos un breve receso después de esta mesa para presentar a la segunda. Muchísimas gracias. Perdón, esta es la última. Les recordamos que va a haber visita guiada a las exposiciones del museo si desean quedarse para participar en las visitas y tendremos un cóctel después. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, pues mil gracias por estar de vuelta y vamos a abrir nuestro segundo panel del día. Este panel las presentaciones van a estar en inglés. Voy a presentar a cada uno de nuestros ponentes también en inglés y el título de nuestro panel es Expanding the Archive, Countering Hegemonic Narratives, expandir el archivo, confrontar las narrativas hegemónicas. Y voy a dejar que cada uno de nuestros ponentes nos hable y cuente sobre este asunto tan importante y central al tema del archivo y el tema del archivo para las prácticas artísticas y las también investigaciones en torno al arte. Y vamos a iniciar nuestro panel con la presentación de Dominique POLANCO, and she's an assistant professor of Latin American art in the Department of Religion and Culture at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Her research explores Mesoamerican manuscripts, particularly those by Nahua Tlahuiloque, I hope I pronounced that right, is the artist scribes in central Mexico in the 15th and 16th centuries. She's co-editing the Routledge Companion to Race in Early Modern Artistic Material and Visual Production with Nicholas Jones and Christina Lee. So Dominique, thanks so much, and just the floor is yours.
Okay. This? ¿Sí? Ok. ¿Mejor? Ok. Gracias. Y quiero empezar para decir gracias por invitarme. Y I want to thank all the organizers and those of you who came back from lunch. I appreciate that too. I want to first foreground that this is a portion of one of my book chapters. And so it's, I've reframed it to work within more centering the archive than the manuscript, but it's centered on the manuscript that my entire book focuses on. So let's begin. I first want to, okay. I first wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement stating that the Valley of Mexico was the territory of the Nahua, Ixcan, Tlahtoloan, the Triple Alliance, as many of you might know it, and home to diverse Mesoamerican groups at the time of the Spanish invasion in 1519. Nahuas, along with other Mesoamerican peoples, persist on this land to this day, despite more than 500 years of genocide and colonialism. And I find this important in many reasons, but one of them is that my argument is centered on the fact that there's erasure through the creating of a codex and then therefore copying of a codex in a Spanish archive that continues this idea of colonialism. So first, I wanted to introduce the manuscript that I'll be centering on for this talk and my book as well. It's called the Pintura del gobernador, alcaldes y regidores de México. From now on, I'll be calling it the Pintura for all of us. It is a manuscript created in 1565 by a combination of Nahuatl or artist scribes, Spanish scribes, and translators from Spanish to Nahuatl as well. Here are the two kind of original, semi-original title pages that begin the manuscript. What is called the Pintura today is essentially 39 folios, front and back, with a combination of text and images. It is very much so part of a larger manuscript that is mostly pure text. It was composed or completed in 1565. It covers events that happened in and around Mexico City between 1555 and 1564. And it was essentially their testimonials that were written and explained of abuses by Spaniards and elite Nahuas towards other Nahuas in and around Mexico City. What I'm showing you here are some of the most kind of famous or well-known folios from the Pintura, especially the Triple Alliance and the second from the left. The one and only extant image that we have of the colonial tekban is what is folio 38. You, if anyone studied this manuscript before, might know it as the Codex Osuna, and I'll explain why in a moment. But again, as art historians, why this manuscript has been so important and interesting is the combinations of both image and text. The texts are in Spanish and Nahuatl, and the images themselves are, and this is a great example that I've given you here of pre-Spanish invasion glyphic writing, Nahuatl writing in particular, as well as Renaissance influenced perspective and realism. So most of my talk will be centered in the 19th century. I just wanted to introduce the manuscript itself. And I wanted to begin in 1878 for this with the quote discovery and the first reproduction of the Pintura. So by 1824, Spain, as we know it today, had lost to independence the majority of its colonies in the Americas, and by 1890 had lost the rest of its colonies in the Caribbean and the Philippines and Asia. This was a crisis in many ways of Spain as it kind of emerged as a nation and also was re-evaluating its power within a kind of a global space. Here we have the best version of the dandy that is the Duke of Osuna, the 12th Duke of Osuna. It was his collection, his family's collection, in which the Pintura was, quote unquote, discovered. He was, for kind of every rights and purposes, a good example of a noble or former noble in the late 19th century. His family had long roots. They dated their kind of nobility back to the medieval period and the Crusades, in fact, where they aided the Christian cause and were granted their status. His family, over time, had accumulated thousands of both books and images, paintings, you name it. By the 1850s, he had lost the majority of the wealth, kind of liquid wealth, and was at the point where he was beginning to give or sell the majority of his family's collection to what had now become national collections, private collections. Specifically with books, he had more than 4,000 manuscripts in this collection and more than 3,000, 32,000 printed volumes. And so most of these books went to the National Library, which is now known as the National Library in Madrid. And within that very vast collection is where the Pintura was discovered. When it was discovered, which essentially it was a compilation of loose folios, it was then placed into a hardcover book, which here is actually the reconserved, but the actual original leather is what is on here. That red, the leather was reused for the conservation in the 1970s. And so in the 19th century, in 1883, is when this manuscript was found within his collection, and it was by his family's librarian, who was kind of organizing the books and manuscripts to go to the National Library. Most of his collection, and especially what the National Library was interested in, were books and manuscripts related to Spanish identity and Spanish history. And so manuscripts that talked about the Crusades, plays, poems, anything really related to lifting up this idea of the Spanish nation, which of course the library was very interested in. And so in context of that, the Pintura being within that collection was pretty interesting and sort of an outlier. This is one of very few manuscripts that have paintings, especially that come from New Spain. When it was discovered and became part of the collection of the National Library, this is another title page that was added to it in 19th century hand that again kind of gives it the title that I use today. It also, as I showed you, was placed into a book, therefore making it a codex in format. Also to celebrate this discovery, and was in kind of the tradition of what was happening in this 19th century reconstitution of libraries, books, and the nation in Spain, a facsimile was created of the manuscript. What I'm showing you here is both the title page and the introduction. The first page of the introduction, I've underlined a point that I will get to in a moment. The introduction itself is 5.5 pages. It includes this very grandiose explanation of what the book is. It also explains some of the context of the manuscript. Curiously, the last 3 pages of the only 5.5 of the introduction also include an excerpt from another manuscript in France, which really doesn't make any sense other than kind of putting it in with this larger discourse of manuscripts in the colonial period. Also within this introduction, there's a very large quote from Humboldt, so kind of situate both its importance as something from Mesoamerica, situating within this 19th century interest in discovering pre-contact and colonial Mesoamerica as well. So what I've underlined here, and it's in Spanish, but I have the translation here. It says, in the rich library of His Excellency Sir Duke of Osuna, a precious Mexican hyphenated Castilian codex is kept, and continues on to explain kind of the dates and who the people were within the context. And so first and foremost, stating that it was in this library of this very important Duke. And then also I want to note the use of the word precious. And so that's sort of this concept of, which will continue to emerge, of this fetishization of how precious and important and valuable, and also a reason to have this in your collection, right, to purchase the facsimile itself. What the facsimile is after this printed introduction is 39 lithographic copies of every single page. And so they were were printed and then hand painted afterward. Their original print was only 100. However, I have found unnumbered copies, so I believe there's another series that were likely produced as well. Because they were hand painted, there's a series of kind of differentiations, not only from the original, but from themselves, differing in pigments, applications, etc. Part of my argument within that is that possibly people weren't as interested in seeing the likeness to the original as much as owning this within a larger collection. Within the introduction also states that this is meant for aficionados or fans of such Mesoamerican antiquities. So fitting in this idea of collecting, who would want to own it, someone who'd want this on their shelf along with many other copies of the time. Along with this facsimile is a celebration of the manuscript. about 15 or so years later, was a large exhibition that took place in the same place where it now is the library. This was called the Exposición Histórico-Americana de Madrid. This coincided, as I'm sure you recognize, with the 400th year anniversary of Columbus's exploration, discovery of America, air quotes for all that, his invasion of the Caribbean and therefore the Americas. It took place, in what we see here today, in the Palacio Biblioteca y Museos Nacionales, which is now the place of the National Library in Madrid. It took place 4 years before it eventually became the actual library, and so it's a space that, as you can see, is a neoclassical design built from the ground up in order to house it was supposed to be a combination of library and museum, and eventually became only the library. Within the floor plan, as there are several floors, there were many different countries that participated in this large exhibition. Those who participated were extensions in many ways of colonialism. They either had participated in colonialism and or were affected by Spanish colonialism particularly. So nations that had emerged within the last 24 or so years. Each room was dedicated to different countries on one of the floors, and there also was a room, 22 in particular, of all the numbered rooms, that was dedicated to Documentos de Indias. This is important to note because there is an important difference between colonial objects and pre-contact objects. What I'm showing you here is this Spanish installation. This was in the foyer when you walked into the main exhibit. As you can see, it very much is in the theme of Cabinet of Curiosities. It's almost overwhelming in stimulation of what there is to see. Many of you might recognize different versions of castas, featherworks. A lot of these pieces are now in the Museo de Americas in Madrid. This, again, is what Spain presented as itself. So it's a hodgepodge and a major collection of colonial pieces. Different from Mexico and how they presented themselves. Mexico participated, as many other new nations had. They had 3 full rooms as well as the patio that I'm showing you here as well. They sent replicas in full size of some of their major pieces. Many of these you might recognize from the Anthropology Museum. The museum, the early Anthropology Museum, were the ones who created and sent the pieces. Under the direction of the Junta Colombina in Mexico, they sent replicas, but also they particularly and importantly centered on the pre-Spanish invasion period, which is what most of these pieces are. And so as Barbara Mundy and Dana Lubson wrote in their article, this intentional emphasis on what their prehistory and the glory of that, particularly centering the Mexica history of now the nation of Mexico, and erasing or kind of skipping over what was the colonial. So Spain kind of filled that. And so you can see the 2 agendas really were almost in conflict within the same space. This exhibit was discussed in many different places. Here is one of the many newspaper articles that discussed it. This comes from the newspaper La Dinastía, which is actually from Barcelona. The author here went kind of room by room and discussed his favorite points. In particular, he said, quote, "The multitude of documents that were in room 22 came from throughout Spain." And so the document room was actually predominantly colonial pieces that Spain already had in their collection. So again, furthering this idea of the glorification of the colonial period for Spain, the nation. He also discusses within this particular newspaper article the Pintura. And he says, quote, "The pages flaunt a multitude of crude figures, true figures, illuminated. They are not dishonest, a rare case in this licentious age in which the margins of books were adorned with the most indecent and obscene scenes," end quote. If you cringe, that's good. So the point is, once again, flaunting this anti-Indigenous concept of trueness, likeness, dishonesty. And again, the Pintura is and continues to be, and has been even in the 20th century by authors and scholars, considered to be this impetus of the transition into more European style imagery. And so truthfulness is what is being displayed. Again, this is a national newspaper, and so people are coming from all over Spain and other parts of Europe, and this kind of sets up the stage of how these pieces were viewed. So in conclusion, and again, this is the case that was in that Spain room, I want to revisit this idea of fetishism. That was sort of the impetus of both my title and the lens I was looking at when thinking about how the National Library is keeping and continues to uphold this idea of value, centering in this idea of the other, the religious use of fetishism fits perfectly, but also I further it into the idea, Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, which I argue is part of the facsimile, this idea that they would create a copy that could be sold, that you can have on your shelf, which both of these further the distance of the hand of the indigenous person who made it. So the Nawa people are continuously decentering, are continuously being colonized as part of my argument throughout my book as well, and that commodification of fetishization is more or less the issue at hand. And so I want to leave you with this newer image of the Biblioteca Nacional, kind of piggyback on the earlier panel today. My experience entering there is probably as hard as anyone who's tried to look at colonial pieces, especially in Europe. It takes a very long time, lots of petitions, lots of requests. That again sort of began this question I had of why is it even here in Spain, and let alone why is it so hard for me, somewhat of Mexican descent, to see something that is part of my ancestry. And so with that, I'd like to say Tascomati, gracias, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dominique. That was really interesting. And we move on to Chloe Courtney's talk. Chloe is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She specializes in the modern and contemporary arts of the hemispheric Americas and is currently developing a dissertation on the ideological connections between textiles, ceramics, and indigeneity in modern and contemporary art, directed by Dr. Edward Sullivan. Chloe previously completed her MA in art history at the University of New Mexico, where she studied eco-critical and decolonial theory under Dr. Clancy Cornejo. In fall 2023, Chloe will begin a one-year appointment at the Vilcek Curatorial Fellow at the Museo del Barrio in East Harlem, New York.
Estaba allá. Ya está. Aquí. Ya está. Gracias. Thank you so much, Ana. ¿Debo compartir por Zoom? Sí. Okay. Okay, un segundo. Esto. ¿Funciona? Sí. Okay. Gracias. Well, thank you to all of the organizers and to Ana Maria for having me, and thank you to Dominique for the first presentation. In the installation, ¿Quién medirá el espacio? ¿Quién medirá el momento? Handmade ceramic forms of animals, mask-like faces, corn cobs, gourd-shaped vessels, and tooled gears tower in 7 vertical columns. Mexican conceptual artist Mariana Castillo de Val developed this work in collaboration with the Taller Coatlicue, a family-run ceramics workshop under the direction of Maestra Ana Maria Hernandez Alarcón, and that is her in the purple shirt at the front. Together, the collaborators visited Rufino Tamayo's collection of ancient art in Oaxaca City at the Museo de Arte Prehispánico and selected certain objects to form a new visual repertoire as part of an imagined cosmology they developed together. The work aptly demonstrates how craft, or artesanía, functions as an implicit archive of indigeneity in Mexico. Here, 2 major factors invoke the traditional indigenista link between craft and indigeneity. One is the medium of earthenware ceramics. The material of clay carries a direct primordial cultural association with the earth. The second factor is the interstitial position of the potters, the members of the Taller Coatlicue, between the role of artist and artisan, between creative agent and commissioned technical labor. Whereas Castillo de Val is recognized internationally as a conceptual artist and a researcher, the Martinez Alarcón family occupy a different position in the hierarchical power structure of the art world. Their Zapotec ethnicity, their traditional methods of low-fired earthenware ceramics, and the fact that they mine ancestral clay sources all contribute to perceptions of their work as craft or artesanía, best suited for the tourist trade that drives the economy of Oaxaca state. Thus, I began this research by asking, to what extent does the installation reinforce a harmful logic of authenticity by collapsing ancient objects, indigenous cosmologies, and the present-day contemporaneity of the Taller Coatlicue ceramicist? Interviews I conducted very recently with Castillo de Ball, with the commissioning curator Oliver Martinez Kant of the Contemporary Art Museum in Oaxaca, and with members of the Martinez Alarcón family, have revealed that the answer to this question depends greatly on one's positionality. From an outside perspective, it would seem that this installation operates largely through an indigenista construction of authenticity, especially given the fact that this installation has been exhibited in many different locations with varying degrees of supporting context. Yet for Castillo de Ball, the columns' combination of ancient and contemporary forms and their idiosyncratic embedded narratives subvert the colonial logics of archaeology and anthropology. Meanwhile, for Ana María Alarcón Hernández and her son Adrián, what distinguishes this project from other work commissioned by artists who visit Oaxaca to work with the local potters is the way the columns unite time and space, the way they manifest the vital Zapotec cosmovision that Adrián has reclaimed as an integral part of his identity and his ceramics practice. So before analyzing this installation in detail, I want to delineate how the concepts of indigeneity, artesanía, and time intersect in the ideological construction of Mexico as a modern nation state. As many of you know, in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, liberal intellectuals like the Minister of Education, José Vasconcelos, and anthropologist and archaeologist Manuel Gamio proposed that Mexico's indigenous heritage could serve as a point of national pride, the groundwork for a sense of collective identity after the partisan violence of the revolution. According to their indigenista system of thought, Mexico's indigenous legacy would energize its emergence as a modern state, distinguishing it from the imperial nations of Europe and of North America. But at the same time, as reformers celebrated Mexico's indigenous cultures, they also viewed them as degenerate and believed that the liberal elite urgently needed to assimilate these backward and rural indigenous peoples into a unified modern society. Cultural anthropologist Shelley Arrington's illustration from her book, The Death of Authentic Primitive Art and Other Tales of Progress, aptly illustrates how the proponents of indigenismo could both celebrate Mexico's indigenous legacy while also submitting its contemporary indigenous population to a patriarchal program of modernization. So here, Arrington illustrates how the linear axes of time and value divide the constructed opposition of culture and nature. The historical Mexica, Maya, Zapotecs, and other pre-Hispanic societies would fall under Arrington's category of historical precursors, which you see sort of at the center, at the intersection of the two axes. Their respectable systems of divine kingship, monumental architecture, writing systems, and agricultural development enable them to join this group of historical precursors. But the indigenous communities of 20th century Mexico, having been ravaged by disease, violent killings, massive population decline, forced labor, and importantly, by the intentional epistemicide of the Spanish invasion, seemed to Mexico's liberal urban elite more like the timeless savages that Arrington, this constructed category of the timeless savage that Arrington delineates in the lower quadrant, apart from culture embedded in nature. As historian Rick Lopez explains, the liberal elite tended to believe that indigenous communities were poor, ignorant, and illiterate, not because of the violence of the invasion, but by nature. And thus, they conceptually located them in this eternal prehistory outside of historical progress. So while indigenous communities have indeed practiced ceramics, weaving, embroidery, and other craft techniques for centuries, the visibility of these different techniques as part of the broader category of artesanía is a more recent development. Craft theorist Glenn Adamson has explained that in Europe, the category of craft emerged in response to the nascent industrialization of labor in the 18th century as a reaction to the rapid restructuring of work and domestic life. However, in Mexico, the role of artesanía as the essential expression of Mexicanidad also emerged in the context of post-revolutionary modernization, but it was completely enmeshed with the notion of indigeneity and thus with race. In contrast to prior generations' embrace of European aesthetics, artists and reformers like Adolfo Best Muggard, Dr. Atl, and Roberto Montenegro studied products like ceramics, textiles, lacquerware, and tooled leather, seeking in them a shared aesthetic that was authentic to Mexico. And in 1921, the exhibition of popular art, organized by Jorge Enciso, Dr. Atl, and Montenegro in conjunction with the centennial of Mexico's independence from Spain, brought this aesthetic into the public eye, transforming popular culture into an object of national pride. And at left, you have an image from the exhibition. As Lopez describes, the exhibition and its accompanying catalog served multiple purposes. They articulated a vision of popular art that was tied to indigeneity. They encouraged the urban middle class to appreciate and seek out objects of popular culture. And they also took advantage of the Centennial's international viewership to canonize popular art as the apex of Mexican authenticity on an international scale. The structure of the exhibition and its accompanying catalog presented the indigenous artisans not as individual agents, but as intuitive representatives of a uniquely Mexican creative instinct. And importantly, by uniting objects from across the different regions of Mexico, the exhibition also canonized artesanía as a system for uniting the country's distinct and far-flung territories, cultures, and language groups, a kind of archive of indigeneity. On the local level, and pertinent to this research, Dr. Atl's catalog solidified the reputation of one Oaxacan village, Santa María Atzompa, as a producer of green glazed earthenware, which you see at right and which tour guides continue to promote. In fact, the local history of craft in Santa María Atzompa is what first drew Castillo de Bal's interest in collaborating with potters from this particular town. So in 2013, Castillo de Bal's Journal of Art and Anthropology, Ixitla, published an article by Kitzia Barrera, which documented the collaborative investigation of the history of ceramics in Atzompa. And what you see here is the title of that article, as well as the timeline which researchers collaboratively developed of the history of ceramics as it unfolded in Atzompa. Atzompa has a millenary ceramics tradition dating back to the height of the Zapotec administrative and religious center known as Monte Alban. Potters today continue to use the same clay mines that potters of the Monte Alban era used from around 200 to 800 CE. And so, as we saw by the time of the exhibition of popular art in 1921, Atzompa had become widely known for its green lead-based glaze. However, this timeline, formulated by art historian Mariana Rubio and archaeologist Leonardo Ruiz, demonstrated that the green glaze was in fact a colonial adoption of the 18th or 19th century. So in 2013, Innovando la Tradición, which is a network of artisans founded by Kitzia Barrera, began working with Atzompan potters to reconstruct historical techniques and forms that had been lost. This project, which catalyzed a movement in Atzompa to break free of the green glaze, in fact validated a decision which Maestra Ana María Hernández Alarcón of Taller Coatlicue had made years earlier to return to the earthenware and blackware techniques that she remembered her grandfather using. So Ana María Alarcón explained that when she shifted from this typical green glaze to the earthenware and blackware techniques, everyone else in Atzompa thought she was crazy about 20 years ago. But now more and more potters have begun to go back to these older methods. When Innovando la Tradición and the Atzompa artisans organized the exhibition Miradas al Pasado, Gazes to the Past, at the Atzompa Community Museum to present the results of this research, INA, the National Institute of Anthropology, sent representatives who accused the group of illegally replicating pre-Hispanic objects. What you see here is an image that they were able to capture before INA arrived of one of the planned exhibits, which shows the contemporary responses to an ancient three-legged vessel that is pictured below, and then a portion of the timeline which shows the evolution of three-legged vessels in Atzompa over time. So this was, contemporary potters responding to their tradition, but we're told that these replicas were illegal. And INHA targeted the community leaders Ronaldo Regino and Juan Ruiz and asked them to sign over the rights of this collaborative research project to INHA. And it forced the exhibition to close on the eve of its opening. So Kitzia Barrera, the organizer behind Innovando la Tradición, asked in response to this incident, to whom does our material culture belong? What do we mean by our culture? Where shall we place a new emerging material culture created by a collective that for centuries has been denied access, or that has, in the best of cases, been disrupted and remained invisible to the institutions that are supposed to support it? End quote. So these are the questions which were published in Mariana Castillo de Bal's journal Ixipla, and which motivated the installation at hand, ¿Quién medirá el espacio? ¿Quién medirá el momento? A little background on Castillo de Bal and from where she approached this project. So as some of you may know, Castillo de Bal has a longstanding interest in replicas and their presence in museum collections and the role they play in archaeological studies. Her work situates replicas as a point of rupture. In Amarantus, the recent mid-career survey, which took place last year here at MUAC, Castillo de Bal showed the work Jaguar Storage, which includes a plaster cast of a Maya tombstone from the site of Chichen Itza. Also on view was the original tombstone from Chichen Itza and a mid-century rubbing taken by the Mayanist Merle Green Robertson. Castillo de Bal challenges us with this work to ask which object is more valuable and why. How does the process of replication change our encounter with this ornate image of a jaguar? Related work, Hieroglyph Storage, combines plaster replicas of Maya glyphs and architectural friezes with impressions that Castillo de Bal produced from contemporary architectural ornament. The enigmatic silhouettes of the artist's cast, which you see at middle right, give no sign of the object's origins. It is the museum storage system, which tells us that these enigmatic symbols, like the other examples, must be significant. So by dint of comparison, Castillo de Bal establishes that her own contemporary intervention, unfixed from contextual meaning, is no more and no less arbitrary an inclusion than the glyphs that have been separated from their context. She's employing the museum context itself to reveal how replicas for archaeological study fragment cultural heritage in the very process of systematizing, cataloging, and storing it. So in the context of INHA's prohibition against replicas by the Atzompa potters and Castillo de Bal's own prior research into replicas for archaeological purposes, she sought to formulate a new contemporary visual repertoire in conjunction with Taller Coatlicue. And she and the Martinez Alarcón family decided to take the collection of the Rufino Tamayo Museum of Pre-Hispanic Art as a point of departure. For this group of collaborators, Castillo de Bal and the potters from Atzompa, the idiosyncratic structure of Tamayo's collection was an important reference. For unlike the National Museum of Anthropology's encyclopedic scope and its strict taxonomies, the Museo Tamayo positions its holdings as artworks, valuable for their aesthetic power. The thematic cases make connections across different cultures, documenting the continuity and communication of core themes across the indigenous space of Anahuac. So Castillo de Bal asked each member of Taller Coatlicue to select 2 artworks from the Tamayo collection, and also to bring influences from their own lives, such as these gears and machinery that the member Ramiro Martinez Alarcón uses in his car workshop, and this spinning top toy, which brought a sense of childhood nostalgia and play and movement. Castillo de Bal then divided the group into 2 and asked each group to tell a story of the universe using their new archive of images, and you can see the visual references that they were working with. She chose 2 different timescales and instructed one group to tell the story of the universe in a day and the other to tell the story of the universe in 100 years. But Mariana explains that the 2 independent stories that resulted were in fact much the same. Both were tied to the processes that potters undertake to source their clay, to dry it, to grind it, mix it with water, shape it into vessels, and fire it before finally taking it to the market to sell. Adrián Martínez Alarcón explained to me that this is because ceramics harmonizes the relationship of nature and humanity by incorporating the elements of earth, water, wind, movement, and fire to create new life. So it seems that for Castillo de Ball, the significance of the project lay in the group's successful reappropriation of pre-Hispanic forms that belong most directly to Oaxaca's indigenous communities. Oliver Martinez Kant, the curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art, where the work was first displayed, commented that the presence of traditional pottery in the contemporary museum setting was a watershed for Oaxaca City, despite the fact that tourism in the area relies on local artesanía and the ceramics of despite the fact that tourism relies on local artesanía, the ceramics of the Central Valley had never before been considered an artistic legacy. Yet for Adrián and Ana María Larzón, the members of Taller Coatlicue who are most invested in stewarding the afterlife of this installation, the work is important not as an imagined or an alternative archive, but as a distilled expression of the Zapoteca cosmology, which they have reclaimed through years of research and practice. So to that end, I want to conclude here just with a detailed explanation of the iconography of this column, which is titled Columna Origen del Universo en 100 años, Column of the Origin of the Universe in 100 years. So just briefly, I want to look at some of the source material. These are a few of the objects which the Taller Coatlicue members selected from the Tamayo collection to include in their new visual repertoire. So at upper left, there's a dog, and in the Zapoteca worldview, a dog accompanies the spirits of the dead to Mitla, the afterlife. Below is a figure which the Taller Coatlicue members identified as an earth mother. And this image also shows the atypical display tactics of the Museo Tamayo, where objects are presented without archaeological or geographic identifiers. At center is a horned warrior, and Adrián explained that for him, this warrior is not a bellicose figure, but rather a metaphor for continuing the struggle between life and death that sustains cosmic balance. And then finally at right is a figure which symbolizes the spirit of the pochote tree, a tree native to Oaxaca, and one of 4 that upholds the cosmos and whose roots reach into the underworld. Left here is an image of the trunk of the pochote, and the spiky texture appears in both ancient and contemporary Oaxacan pottery. Another millenary form is that of the bule, or the gourd vessel, and this shape dates back to the earliest adoption of earthenware ceramics as an alternative to dried gourds. So at left, we have an example from the Tamayo collection, and at center, versions of the oversized bules that Ana María made for the installation. So all of the participants agree that the visual archive of traditional pre-Hispanic and contemporary forms invite the viewer to invent their own narratives. But Adrián and Ana María at the same time want to convey a nuanced understanding of the vitality and complexity of Zapotec beliefs. So for them, the base of this column is the Earth Mother figure. Above her, the sustaining trunk of the pochote tree, and then the tree's masculine spirit. An earthenware vessel transforms into a turkey, a guardian spirit, and then a meditative, ecstatic horned warrior who represents the ongoing struggle of life and death. The wooden spinning top brings movement. The dog vessel guides us into the underworld, where we encounter, again, another representation of the pochote tree, and a bat, a critical nighttime pollinator and guardian figure. Above this, we have the bule, the millenary form, which connects past and present, man-made ceramics, and the natural gourd shape. And above it, a mechanical gear, which symbolizes the cyclical nature of time and its inextricability from space. And it transforms into a sun, linking back to the fertile Earth Mother at the column's base. So we see how this installation disrupts the constructs of artesanía, of authenticity, and instead asserts the contemporaneity and importance of Zapotec cosmology. And the question that remains to consider is whether this level of specificity is evident for viewers when these columns are exhibited singly and without detailed context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Now we move on to Jerónimo Duarte Riasco's talk. Jerónimo is an assistant professor of Latin American and Iberian cultures at Columbia University. His research, teaching, and curatorial projects concentrate on modern and contemporary artistic practices with special attention to their literary and visual manifestations in Latin America. He completed his PhD in Spanish and Latin American literatures with a secondary field in visual and environmental studies at Harvard University. His current book project, tentatively titled Almost the Same but Not Quite, The Prosthetic Condition in Latin American Artistic Practices, studies works of art that simultaneously feature literary and visual components and that were produced in the region after 1980. And we'll start in a minute.
No. Sí. Gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias a Ana María por la presentación y para Ana María y a todos el resto de los organizadores de la Trienal. Es realmente un placer estar aquí y compartir mi trabajo y bueno, aprender sobre todas estas investigaciones que están pasando en estos trabajos tan estimulantes de los colegas. Como saben y como pueden ver ahí, mi presentación de hoy se titula The Futility of the Archive, Collecting Images and Sounds in Oscar Muñoz's Work. Y debo confesar que me siento un poco incómodo de presentar este trabajo en inglés. No solamente soy colombiano, sino que estamos en México y voy a hablar sobre un artista colombiano. Y además, y a diferencia de mis panelistas, voy a hacerlo en inglés con acento. Entonces les pido disculpas por esa disonancia. El trabajo que voy a presentar hoy hace parte de una investigación más amplia, cuya escritura avanza en inglés y por eso también lo voy a presentar en ese idioma, y en el que estoy tratando de mirar casos de arte moderno y contemporáneo colombianos por ahora, en los que los artistas usan herramientas de ficción para cuestionar nuestras capacidades de entender lo real. Y como consecuencia introducen la duda como un principio relacional guía para la construcción de sentido. Es un proyecto que está apenas en sus etapas iniciales, de manera que lo que presentaré está lejos de ser un argumento acabado y estoy muy entusiasmado por oír sus preguntas y comentarios más tarde. Entonces, bueno, con ese disclaimer voy a empezar. The Futility of the Archive. It seems fitting to start today's presentation with some images from an archive. As you can see, they depict someone unaware passersby strolling along the streets of Cali, Colombia, and at some point during the early 1940s to mid-1970s. The anonymous subjects were captured by equally anonymous photographers called fotocineros, who work in the city's public space, snapping pictures of its citizenry and later offering them for sale to the candid models. Naturally, a significant number of the images were not purchased, and their contact sheets ended up feeding forgotten piles that would remain stored in many of the city's photography studios, inadvertently constructing unofficial archives of the city's street life. One of said archives was purchased in the mid-1970s by Colombian artist Oscar Muñoz, who in turn archived them until the late 2000s when he repurposed it to complete several projects. All of them were part of Archivo por Contacto, and they displayed in different ways a selection of the fotocineros' images. Digital prints over an exhibition table, a video projection from the Ortiz Bridge onto the waters of Cali's river, or an artist's book featuring some of the images as, perhaps, meaningful pairs. Muñoz's intervention made available fragments of these unofficial public archives and suggested a syntax of sorts to perhaps increase their legibility. I will return to Archivo por Contacto in a moment, but now allow me a slight digression whose importance will become visible, turning to another piece by Muñoz where the artist collects not only images but also sounds. This is A Través del Cristal, a 2008-2018 installation that at first glance seems to be a collection of framed family photos belonging to more to someone's living room and less to an exhibition space. Upon closer examination, however, one realizes that the photographs are actually videos of framed photographs displayed in someone's living room. that also happened to capture the reflection on the glass of the portraits at the time when the video was shot. The video also includes the contextual sounds of the sites where the original image lives, from street vendors offering ripe guavas to the voice of children playing outside. A Través del Cristal is, as you just witnessed, a piece that is difficult to describe, partly because it displays conflicting, often random fragments in different media and is susceptible to participating in different processes of meaning production. Its visual and oral cacophony makes it arguably unintelligible. Much of Oscar Muñoz's work consists of attempts to collect and intervene images and sounds, to manipulate and repurpose extant archives. Muñoz's archivist impulse is, needless to say, radically different from those criticized by canonical figures like Foucault or Derrida. His images and sounds, often fragmented and disjointed, have no objectivity claim and do not attempt to seize the past nor to engage in the production of future as past in an effort to perpetuate structures of domination. Instead, Muñoz provides us with effective archives, and his interventions frequently dilute sense while simultaneously challenging the spectator to produce their own. In other words, they present us with an effective epistemology produced through fiction. In Archivo por Contacto, and in particular in the River and the book Iterations, a subtle meaning is enacted yet never stated. In the River projection, we get a glimpse of sense resulting from the photographic selection and the semantic value of the context where they are projected: running water under a bridge in downtown Cali, a city situated in a country with a violent past that has used rivers in morbid ways. And in the book, the pairing of the images provides, together with the testimony of certain fotocineros, a window into the city's everyday, precisely the everyday that seldom makes into the official archives. In A Través del Cristal, on the other hand, the evocation is much more lyrical and the spectator's gaze much more effective. For the meaning of the piece, the memories that it may activate are intimate and subjective, and function more as underscoring of what time has erased and less as a celebration of what images and sounds have the potential to capture. I choose to start my presentation today speaking about these two works for two main reasons. First, they are a clear example of the ways in which Muñoz's works reveals an active engagement with archives and archival processes. And second, and perhaps more importantly, they exemplify the ways in which his intervention of archival material dilutes sense. And Muñoz's archival material comes in many ways: fotocineros' photographs, family portraits, or quotidian sounds, as is the cases discussed a moment ago, but also, as in other works, images from the press, identity headshots, or drawings of spaces that have now disappeared. It is precisely this engagement with the archive that allows me to propose the main point that I want to make today. My claim is that Muñoz's work does not bring us closest to a world, a reality, that is no longer there, but rather, his pieces underscore reality's unintelligibility and our dependence on fiction to access it. So allow me to illustrate my point with another of his works, perhaps well known to most of you. This is Proyecto para un Memorial, a 5-channel video installation that Oscar Muñoz produced in 2005. There, the spectator witnesses a hand hastily sketching different faces using water on stone. Naturally, the water evaporates quickly, causing the inevitable disappearance of the image. The evanescing faces belong to dead individuals and are based on photographs found in the obituary pages of Colombian newspapers. Not surprisingly, this work has often been read as a way to commemorate and remember those who are gone. It is, after all, a memorial, as an attempt, perhaps a failed one, to grasp a reality that risks disappearing. The artist has stated that he is interested in the instant and the process that occurred so that an image can become consolidated or not in memory. And this preoccupation is certainly visible in the piece. One could argue that the memorial alludes to a sort of cycle, visible as well in other pieces by the artist. There's an object-subject in the world, a human being of flesh and bone, that Muñoz turns into an image in an effort to save them from oblivion. Yet, at the same time, he makes the image unstable, fleeting, and we, as a spectator, witness its disappearance. This disappearance, in turn, returns us to the object, even if only to acknowledge that it's gone forever, that time has passed, and lives have been lost. Today, I want to propose a different cycle to read Muñoz's work, one in which the object of remembrance is not only the human of flesh and bone, but rather the unintelligibility of the real. The cycle would be as follows. There is an object-subject in the world, a human being of flesh and bone, that is captured by a fiction, the photograph in the newspaper. This photograph is later used by the artist to produce another fiction, a new image, but one that negates the illusion of stability promised by photography. Then, Muñoz's image disappears. This time, however, the disappearance does not bring us back into the object, the world, the real, but rather reminds us of our impossibility to approach, understand, and make sense of the real without the mediation of fiction. To put it simply, my claim is that Muñoz's work fosters a philosophical position of doubt while ennobling fiction as a tool to negotiate epistemological uncertainty. His works dissolve the illusion according to which we believe that the real can be fully comprehensible, interpreted, and preserved. And faced with this impossibility, fiction arises as solace. Often, Oscar Muñoz's pieces start with a fiction, not with a falsity, but with a construction, an artificial crafting that determines a particular engagement with the real, a photographic image, for instance. María Ángela Menges, in her essay for the catalog that accompanies Muñoz's recent exhibition in Visibilia, argues that Colombian artists of the 1970s used the photographic gaze as an instrument of reality editing, that is, as a device for sense-making, that granted them the freedom that, for various reasons, was not available before. Muñoz, Mendes argues, productively engages with this photographic gaze as a starting point for some of his pieces. It is visible, for example, in works from the cities interiores, produced during 1980s. Other times, it is a proper photograph that serves as a source material. More specifically, he uses images that claim to objectively refer to the real. Newspaper photographs, as in Proyecto para un Memorial, or entire newspaper pages, as in País Tiempo. Identity headshots, like in 4x3, maps, as seen in Auditorio, and depictions from books like those used for Libro Abierto. As visible in the images I just showed you, Muñoz takes these fictions, these photographic images, and intervenes them to question their legitimacy, blurring, disappearing, fragmenting, burning, juxtaposing, superimposing different media. From there, we are faced as spectators with two immediate options. We can assume that the fallibility that was just enacted is, in fact, a property of the image, that representations are always partial and to some degree false, and a property that the appearance of art is deceiving and manipulative, etc. Or we can go a slightly different route. We can read the waning of the images as saying something about the world, as underscoring its unintelligibility. The difference between the two approaches is small, but I think significant. It is not that images are deficient, that they fade, that they are unstable like memories, and that with time, they end up losing their connection to the real because in one way or another, the real acts on them. They are destroyed by the power of natural elements or the power of forgetting. It is the opposite. Images capture the real, or at least attempt to do so. They give us the illusion that there is a possibility to access the world, to understand it, to remember it. Is it possible then to read Muñoz's work as a practice that destroys the image to bring us back to the real and reminds us that our only hope to grasp it, as present, as past, as future, is through fiction, imperfect as it may be? Is it possible then to see in his works as enacting the inapprehensible character of the world and simultaneously underscoring the deficiencies of fiction as the only tool available to attempt to grasp it? If we doubt the tool that gives us access to the real, are we bound to doubt the real as well? Muñoz's fleeting images functions as what Jean-Paul Sartre termed the analogon, a stimuli that serves as an equivalent for perception. Sartre, writing in 1940, was interested in theorizing the dematerializing function of consciousness to address the difference between perception and imagination. For him, perception was inevitably partial, incomplete, and could only develop diachronically. Imagination, on the other hand, was total, instantaneous, and conditioned by our intention. Consequently, the way in which we experience objects, the world, in our minds is radically different from the way in which we experience them phenomenologically, for lack of a better word. Following this logic, the world is simply impossible to access via perception. We are left then with imagination, which was terrifying for Sartre, not so scary for Muñoz, I think. Imagination is consequently more powerful and arguably more practical than perception, given the effect of totality and certainty it produces. The problem is that we tend to confuse the two. Not only do we mistakenly feel, and the affect is important here, that what we imagine is what is or what was, but we mistakenly believe that the world can be accessed as a totality with the certainty with which we are able to access an imaginary image. Most of the images that serve as source material for Muñoz have the pretension to function like the imaginary images discussed by Sartre, even when they are presented as the result of perception. They are intended to activate and, in a way, condense a total image of what is being depicted without acknowledging the impossibility of such an enterprise, just as the candid photos by the fotocineros, especially when approached together, seem to promise a real portrait of Cali's urban life at the time, when in actuality they point to the impossibility of such a depiction. Or, as an alternative example, another of his archival pieces, El Juego de las Probabilidades. The work consists of 12 color photographs, each depicting a different self-portrait of the artist. Each self-portrait was produced with fragments of former identity photographs that were once used to represent the totality of Oscar Muñoz as a Colombian national, as a citizen authorized to drive, etc. The artist cut the original images, the archival source materials, and interwove them to produce a new portrait highlighting the material and philosophical impossibility of the claim that any of these original images make. There are then 3 steps in this operation. First, we have the identity photos, the archival materials that at different moments in time claim to capture the artist objectively. As such, these photographs aim to function as the Sartrean analogon and activate a mental image that would account for Muñoz as a totality. Second, we have the artwork. Muñoz literally tears the image apart, slices it to produce a new analogon, but one that overly questions the possibility of a total perception. And lastly, in the encounter with the spectator, there is a mental image produced, but one that, unlike the one Sartre describes, is aware of its fragmentary condition and consequently reminds us of the impossibility to fully access the world. Yet, El Juego de las Probabilidades does allow us a glimpse of a possible Oscar Muñoz and by proxy of ourselves, because we too have been the subject of identity photographs, and we too know well that the totality of the self does not reside in any of those images. After encountering El Juego de las Probabilidades, one may produce an image that aspires to capture the real Oscar Muñoz as subject in the world. However, at the same time, one is reminded of the impossibility of ever fully experiencing, let alone understanding or grasping, such a reality. Because, as I have been suggesting, Muñoz's work demonstrates that very unintelligibility. Muñoz, as subject in the world, is never really fully accessible to us nor to himself. This inaccessibility of the self that also grants a glimpse of it is similarly thematized in Retrato, a 2004 piece in which the artist used the same technique as that used in Proyecto para un Memorial, but this time he sketched his own image. The self-portrait is never quite finished. The water that traces it evaporates too quickly for the totality to materialize. The single-channel video that supports the piece is displayed in loops, giving the impression of a recurrent failure to grasp the real. The piece, like so many other autobiographical works by Muñoz, succeeds in its failure. Part of the reason why Retrato's fallibility is so potent is because of its humility, because it lacks the reckless confidence of other available images, and because it introduces a doubt about the self that I think also extends to the world. Where claims of certainty about the reals are commonplace, Muñoz's practice erodes such certainties via minor actions, via what Natalia Brizuela has termed a carbon aesthetics, that reminds us that despite all of humanity's attempts to make the world black and white, the truth is, it is gray. One of the most eloquent blows to certainty in Muñoz's work is, I think, the one achieved in Impresiones Débiles. Using photographs that claim to document pivotal moments in Colombian history, the artist intervenes them as to achieve an overexposure effect and then alters the focal point. The maneuver effectively changes the image and questions, of course, the alleged objectivity of photography. But perhaps most importantly, Muñoz's piece reveals the mutability of the real according to positionality and interest. These images demonstrate that the real is dependent on the relations between the elements in it and that such relations are arguably infinite. It is this vastness that prevents full intelligibility. Fiction, a photograph, a text, a work of art by Muñoz, can only aspire to capture a handful of those relations, because it is only in fiction where the real becomes legible. The awareness of doubt that comes with Muñoz's practice is then dual. We doubt the fiction that helps us remember, access, and preserve the world, and we also doubt our very ability as humans to ever satisfactorily access the real. There is also, I think, an ethics that unfolds with this awareness of doubt, a force that compels us to share the uncertainty, that propels us to create in our interactions with other and the world, lugar a dudas, room for doubt, like the name of the art space Muñoz founded in 2005 and has since sustained in collaboration with Salim Islah. And nowhere is doubt about the real and the fictions that we create to approach it more necessary than in a place like Colombia that has suffered for decades the unintelligibility of violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jerónimo. And we're ending our panel with Edward Vasquez's talk. And Edward is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and Architecture at Middlebury College in Vermont, where he has taught since 2009. His first book was a study of the minimalist sculptor Fred Sandback, published by the University of Chicago Press, and he's currently completing a volume on Alfredo Yar's Estudios sobre la Felicidad. His work on Yar has been supported by fellowships from the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., as well as the Ground Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts.
I'll knock over any water. Right. Cool. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this, for the lovely talks that have happened already today. Am I audible? Is this okay to everybody? Cool. Thank you, Ana Maria, for shepherding us through this panel today, and to my fellow panelists for lovely talks. It's nice for me to say at the end here, thank you for such a great day. So I will begin now. In 1980, in Santiago, Chile, Alfredo Yar began asking questions. Are you happy? Estimate the number of happy people in the world. What does happiness mean to you? Yar undertook this questioning as part of a multi-phase project entitled Estudios sobre la Felicidad, which combined the aspiration to a certain, likely impossible, easy conversation with an exaggeratedly official design program that not only telegraphed the seriousness of his endeavor, but often implied a volume of participation that might have made weary individuals comfortable in engaging with the artist's broad queries. Though he had an idea, he didn't ultimately know how people might respond, and in this regard, the titling of the final phrase of Yar's project is telling. Obra abierta y de registro continuo captures the fluidity of potential participation and the attendant impulse to documentation. In many ways, the overall work is a record of silence, of a furtiveness appropriate to its time, yet one that could also be called open for the occasional distortion of its archival veneer in an enticement to engage. And while Yar has referenced the work of Hans Haacke to David Lamelas as precedent, more local comparisons are to the point as well. In fact, Yar was not the only artist in Santiago considering the relationship of performance, archival manifestation, and social critique via a logic of the open work. Hernán Parada, both on his own and in collaboration with Luz Donoso, developed a model of the obra abierta driven by the amplification and activation of images of Chile's detained and disappeared, in Parada's case his brother Alejandro, which recoded openness as an everyday aesthetics of uncertainty rooted in loss. In what follows, I will consider these modes of strategic openness in the ways that they alternately mobilize archival framing and documentary forms via public performance and presentation, each of which only heighten the silences and absences held in their parameters. Over the course of Yar's project, he produced street surveys, conducted and documented interviews, facilitated conversations, and created distinct spaces of reflection and response for his audiences. Studies on happiness developed in response to the pervasive censorship and self-censorship Yar perceived among a fearful population. In hitting on happiness as his theme, Yar recalled, "It's watertight, it's poetic, it's naive. They're not going to do anything to me," he said at the time. As a mix of performance, video installation, photographic documentation, and sociological survey, Yar's project functions as a work of information-driven conceptualism and a housing meant to hold a recursive portrait of its participants. You could call it a time capsule. The nature of Yar's distinct media strategies privileges a renewable openness, a clean slate that encouraged some measure of honesty shared in public and among strangers. In general, and in moments surrounding the approval of a new constitution in September of 1980, when there was indeed much to discuss, Yar's questions were met with sideways responses or tentative replies, if anything at all. Elements of studies expand in many ways. Here, I would like to sketch a link between the portraits of happy and unhappy people, the related situations of confrontation, and the final open work installation, which defines a movement from a bounded quasi-archival space to one of documented fluidity. For the portraits, Yar conducted and recorded several private interviews from which he produced the titular objects. In a quasi-diptych format, a large photograph set above a typed interview extract stands to the left of a shallow plexiglass box that housed further information, the exterior of which was marked with a number meant to suggest the specific interview in Yar's archive. Some details. Set atop a grid, Yar pinned a piece of paper with handwritten personal details, including the name, generalized address, marital status, and occupation of the interviewee, as well as general observations noted by the artist during each conversation and the total duration of the interview. Additionally, Yar affixed a small portrait of the interviewee along with a stamp marking them as either happy or unhappy to the top of the page. Underneath these notes, Yar included 2 photographs of each participant, both smiling and frowning, and beneath these contact prints of the interviewee, presumably taken during the interview. Yar's portraits exploit the visual tropes of bureaucratic identification, from the typed transcripts and the purpose-made stationery to the stamps conferring authenticity and the frontal photographs of the interviewees, who sometimes stand against a slatted wall, evoking the height measurements of a mugshot. As it's impossible to capture the fullness of conversation in a few jottings, we end up with visual dossiers that class each sitter according to a binary distinction with selected support. When asked at the time why he had chosen to deploy the visual language of identity cards and police files, Yar let the wider implications of his charged presentation stand unstated, blankly asserting that these are files, as impersonal as a file. These records are recorded on video, photographed, and typewritten. Extant documentation shows 3 individuals: a happy 37-year-old man named Agustin, number 31, an unhappy 24-year-old woman, Mirna, number 58, and an unnamed man, number 27. In fact, Yar only completed these 3 portraits, assigning them arbitrarily inflated case numbers to suggest that they were chosen from a much larger archive of finished objects. Agustin was a carpenter that Yar knew, Mirna was a classmate of Yar's brother in medical school at the time, and the unnamed man was a friend of Yar's from architecture school. In the situations of confrontation, Yar staged conversations anchored by these interviews, with interviewees agreeing to have their taped conversations shown in public and to participate in a discussion following the screening. He did this twice with 2 different sets of participants, one happy and one unhappy in each case, The individuals sat atop stools, separated by a television where their interviews played, an audience on the floor around them. Only one person who was the subject of a completed portrait participated, the medical student, Mirna, suggesting that Yar, while unable to reach his goal of 100 portraits, did have a larger group of recorded interviews to draw from beyond the 3 that he used for the full portraits of happy and unhappy people. Note that Mirna is designated as portrait number 58, yet in the photo documentation of the situations of confrontation, you kind of have to trust me on the number in that television screen, but I'm not lying to you. She appears as number 67 on the video, a discrepancy that points to Yar's creative construction of his records. The novelty of this presentation found form in conversation. As Yar described, quote, people started to gather and to listen to the pre-recorded interview, and afterwards, suddenly came the question. A member of the audience asked the individual who I had labeled unhappy whether being labeled as unhappy made him even more so. And that was the question that broke open the meeting. They stayed for 2 hours, these people talking about happiness. This dialogical situation proved transformative for the artist. And as he noted, quote, the work began to control me. Each time it produced a real and proper therapy. The experience produced what I was looking for, a freedom in art and the possibility to create new situations and environments. Yar often refers to his architectural training to explain the contextual nature of his work. Yet here, in these conversations, he first experienced how his planned work might respond to a given situation and how in real time, his art could create its own realities, feeding back into the wider contexts he had sought to respond to in the first place. The last element of the project, the video installation titled An Open Work, a Nonstop Record, deployed the television set to different ends. With a screen, a place of active engagement as participants were confronted with their live image. Yar crafted a spare setup of chair, microphone, camera, TV with a VCR set on record. Participants were invited to sit, behold themselves in real time on the monitor, and if so inclined, to answer Yar's questions. Are you happy? And what does happiness mean to you? As a record of engagement, and in addition to the recordings, Yar took Polaroids of the TV screen and posted them on a bulletin board hung over the VCR, tracking participation in real time. In the available archival footage, people respond to Yar's prompts with varying degrees of sincerity, and members of the Santiago art world are here, including Eugenio Ditborn and Lottie Rosenfeld and others. Jokes for children, campy acting, and the adjusting of hair and makeup are more common than thoughtful replies. Many sit, read Yar's prompts quietly, take a moment, sometimes a while, before either getting up in silence or offering a clipped answer. Some critics approaching this array of responses found that, quote, vanity, coquetries, and the novelty of seeing oneself on TV had overshadowed the question at hand, end quote. Whereas others read this behavior with a bit more nuance. Adriana Valdez, Yar's main critical supporter at the time, understood his participants, triangulated between self, video camera, and TV screen, as caught between two phantoms, one of imagined identity and of their related sense of societal expectation. As she would put it, quote, studies on happiness becomes then a record of the narrow margins of freedom that stereotypes allow, end quote. The further exchange between participant, televisual image, and audience is complex, yet here I would like to stress that Yar's physical installation, from the simple lighting and furniture on through Yar's exaggerated double documentation of the screen, asserted a non-threatening space of participation, and just as he marked the many who had opted to do so. Yar conjured an archive in real time, and as a strategy to encourage others to engage, regardless of what people actually said. Yet in Chile, many could not stand silent, even as the climate of fear and self-censorship that Yar described was very real. Indeed, his use of ID-style photography, particularly in the portraits of happy and unhappy people, but also in the close framing of an open work, a nonstop record, not only evokes the imagery of state surveillance and police files, but also echoes the imagery deployed in protest to draw attention to the silenced faces of Chile's detained and disappeared. Though the practice of permanently disappearing political opponents had nearly come to an end by 1980, many of the faces of the approximately 4,000 disappeared could still be seen in plain sight, both in individualized protest and as part of as broader strategies of human rights organizations. Formal responses to state violence in Chile began almost immediately after the coup, with the founding of the Cooperative Committee for Peace in Chile by the Church of Santiago in September of 1973, and after Pinochet shuttered it in 1975, its later incarnation, the Vicariate of Solidarity, in January of 1976. Alongside the Vicariate's early successes in gaining legal standing for families of the detained and disappeared to argue habeas corpus claims in court, they published and circulated a bi-monthly church bulletin, Solidaridad, dedicated to social issues. Between November of 78 and May of 79, the Archbishopric of Santiago and the Vicariate jointly published a 7-volume series, Donde Están, reproducing dossiers on 478 detained and disappeared persons prepared by the Vicariate's lawyers. At the most basic level, the Vicariate listened to people, and while listening, developed a framework and an archive to track instances of state violence. The premise underlying this work was simple. According to Vicky Bell, and this is a photograph of hers here taken from an article she wrote, those working with the Vicariate, quote, sought to help and protect the victims of the military repression in Chile by insisting that their lives were valued and that their experiences were worthy of collection and response. The Vicariate collected the details and accounts, premised on a commitment to these fellow citizens and their families. The workers did so not least by the simple acts of registering what they were being told about what was happening, producing data and reports that included both individual and aggregate information about the cases and circumstances reported to them, end quote. So among the most important documents compiled by the Vicariate were photographs of the detained and disappeared, which depending on image quality often required retouching and rephotographing. Ángeles Donoso Macaya explains that, quote, after being cropped, mended, and rephotographed, and sometimes photocopied, the portraits were cataloged in a photographic archive and disseminated through print media. This process, expectedly, produced a sort of standardization, end quote. That is, such common manipulations came to define the visual language of the detained and disappeared. Most images show single individuals in frontal or three-quarter views, occasionally cropped from a group in relative high contrast, with backgrounds masked out in white. They are quickly legible with as little extraneous information as possible to allow for reproduction or enlargement with minimal distortion. These images traveled far beyond family photo albums, as they were transposed onto leaflets and city walls, pinned to the chests of protesters, and reproduced in magazines and other print media. As a set of books, Donde Están, with pages of uneven grids reproducing the faces of the detained and disappeared, extended the strategy of affixing images of disappeared relatives to clothing and or carrying posters asking Donde Están, as they were used, for example, in a multi-week hunger strike in the sanctuary of 3 Santiago churches in May and June of 78, or in the street actions of the Association of the Relatives of the Detained and Disappeared, who in August of 1978 staged protests at the Plaza de la Libertad opposite La Moneda Palace. In Chile, as in many other places, a closely cropped image of a face responded to a national crisis, and many visual artists brought a particular skill set to this activism. Among them, Luz Donoso and Hernán Parada were involved in the archival cataloging and preparing of images for the Vicariate, which they used in other ways as well. In the course of this important work, Donoso created the variable Wincha Sin Fin from copies of the ID photographs she handled for the Association of the Relatives of the Detained and Disappeared. Creating an amendable form that could be easily transported and quickly unrolled, Donoso joined photocopied enlargements of faces to protest flyers, magazine pages, and other ephemera. Parada recalled that with this mixed source material, Donoso hoped, quote, to synthesize all that she saw and considered relevant to show others. This, combined with the desire to go further, he continued, to try and educate and change the observer of this expressive object. Donoso and Parada, in collaboration with others, enacted various support actions, acciones de apoyo, which further served to, quote, amplify and multiply, end quote, the faces of the detained and disappeared. In the most well-known instance, intervention into a commercial system, they made brief use of display televisions in an electronics store on the Paseo Ahumada, momentarily interrupting the regularly scheduled programming with an artistic video that held the recorded image of Lila Valdenegro, who was detained and disappeared in Valparaiso in 1976. Though this work, however, briefly scrambled the signals of official television in ways resonant with Yar's available circuit in an open work, a nonstop record, the artists were adamant that their uses of media were only instrumental. In a text for the 1982 publication Ruptura, edited by the Colectivo de Acciones de Arte, better known as CALA, Donoso, Parada, and Patricia Saavedra explain, quote, "Modes of communication in these actions are the necessary nexus to materialize an action. Although they are indispensable in order to make, register, and show and or disseminate some action or theoretical material, they are not in themselves an artwork, though their influence exists, but rather elements and tools in the artwork's service." Whereas Yar would assert that whether his audience participated or not, the presence of the TV could generate an opening for the viewer to consider what they might say, do, or even think, and as such was integral to the work, in intervention into a commercial system, the screen serves as one amplification device among others to raise awareness and unite elements of a population around a common cause. Yet the concept of an open work drives both forms. In Ruptura, Donoso, Parada, and Saavedra note a range of precedents, including the direct antecedent of Proposición Obra Abierta, which they define as, quote, "the possibility of including all actions destined to solve the detained disappeared problem as part of itself, and creating a continuous system with the capacity, theoretical and practical, to adopt, deal with, influence, and change the trajectory of certain social events," end quote. This proposition refers to Parada's own theorization of an open work, which was the subject of an academic thesis, as well as various individual art actions. In response to the disappearance of his brother Alejandro, abducted from his home in the early hours of July 30th, 1974, Parada enacted Obra Abierta A, which takes as its beginning date the year of his brother's disappearance. While a large part of the project, undertaken in 1984 and 1985, involves Hernan Parada being photographed wearing a mask of his brother's face taken from the retouched image prepared by the Vicariate, and thus materializing his absence as well as animating the photographs used to assert it, an early iteration displaying a small archive of photos and personal items of his brother's was presented in a group show at the Galeria Cal in 1979, where Yar would have his first exhibition that October. In framing his conception of an obra abierta, Parada discusses the work of Marcel Duchamp, Alan Caprow, as well as the writings of Umberto Eco. Ultimately, Parada distinguishes his idea from these earlier precedents via their status as bounded, if indeterminate artworks, rather than open interventions reframing the world. In marking the difference between Eco's open work, itself premised on a certain amount of structural indeterminacy, and his own obra abierta, Parada writes that, quote, "Eco's open work formula is not applicable to the system of obra abierta because the latter, in itself, is not conceived as an artistic work," end quote. In discussing his obra abierta in positive terms, his examples shift beyond art and outside of Chile. In particular, Parada notes his fascination with the trial of the American Gary Gilmore, convicted of first-degree murder in a Utah courtroom in October of 1976, and ultimately executed by firing squad on July 17, 1977, and of the open-endedness, uncertainty, and suspense of the legal process that he encountered in the news. Parada's formulation offers, quote, "the language of artistically translating, which is to say embracing and containing an ongoing life event," end quote, essentially creating an aesthetic redistribution and framing of uncertain situations in everyday life. Parada concretizes this through the example of Obra Abierta M19, which designated the 1980 seizure of the Embassy of the Dominican Republic in Bogota, Colombia, by M19 guerrillas and the ensuing hostage crisis as an unfolding event that could have been developed as an artistic investigation, tracking the news in as many ways as possible during the 61 days of uncertainty, before all hostages were released and the guerrillas granted asylum in Cuba. On the heels of this example, and as a mode of conclusion, Parada gets close to his real concerns, asserting that, quote, "the uncertainty of not being able to know the circumstances of A is enough for declaring it an open work," even as he offers, in a footnote, that A could be the Italian politician Aldo Moro, who was kidnapped and murdered by the Red Brigades in 1978. Parada's purposeful muddling of A in his text stands as evidence of the self-censorship that led Yar to undertake studies on happiness in the first place, even as both sought an aesthetic disturbance, direct or oblique, into the social fabric of Chile at the time. In language that still feels appropriate to Yar's work today, he said, "I believe in art as a detonator of collective consciousness. It produces a feedback. It's a constant game of coming and going. The work draws on social situations, but society also can be changed by this constant questioning, these ruptures, these transformative intentions," end quote. I would offer that feedback can be understood in two ways. First, as Yar likely meant it, a model of systemic interaction between art and the social world. And second, as a type of distortion, a heightening, an alteration, that suggests the uncertainty held in evidence and documents as much as uncertain archives themselves. And this positive disequilibrium, ideally, possibly, is a space of opening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you all for these wonderful talks. Y ahora, para acoger el verdadero bilingüismo de nuestra conferencia, me muevo al español. Y abrimos para preguntas del público. Si tienen, yo no los veo. Yo no los veo porque las luces, no sé si pueden prender las luces en la parte de atrás, pero debe haber unos micrófonos circulando tal vez. Gracias.
Bueno, Débora alzó la mano antes que yo, pero me dieron... La mía es para Chloe. Quería saber si tú contemplas en tu investigación el hecho de que la gran mayoría de las piezas de la colección de Tamayo son falsos. Entonces, esto acercaría, que son falsos que fueron producidos obedeciendo la demanda de los coleccionistas. Entonces, esto los convertiría a estos objetos más en una artesanía, que reafirman la identidad arquetípica de estas culturas ancestrales. Entonces, más allá de la metodología de Mariana Castillo de Val, ¿tú cómo interpretas eso? ¿Cómo entiendes esos objetos que en realidad son un constructo y que estarían más cerca de una artesanía? Entonces hay un loop del cual el taller Coatlicue y estas personas no pueden salir.
Bueno, no soy hispanohablante nativamente, como se ve, pero intentaré responder a la pregunta. Muchas gracias. Entonces, a ver si lo entiendo, la pregunta es cómo yo manejo con el hecho de que las obras del Museo Tamayo son ya reconstrucciones por ser hecho de, ¿cuál era la palabra? ¿Fragmentos? Falsos.
They're fakes.
Bueno, esto, sí, creo que la manera por los artesanos, como podemos decir a los miembros del taller, para ellos es un legado importante no solo del artista Tamayo, pero de la cultura. Y tengo que preguntar a Mariana si ella, no sé si ella disparó o si ella compartió esa información o si era importante para el proceso, porque eso no aparecía en las conversaciones que yo tuve con el artista. Entonces, imaginaría que para ellos, para Mariana tal vez, eso no es tan importante porque su obra ya maneja con esa idea de réplicas y fakes en acervos. Pero sí, ese tipo de pregunta es precisamente lo que estoy intentando manejar, porque la posición de Mariana y del taller es muy diferente en interagir con el legado prehispánico, como se puede ver. Entonces, esa cuestión de verosimilitud y autenticidad, tengo que manejar con eso, pero no sé si es algo que destruye el significado del presente instalación. Espero que contesto bien su pregunta. Gracias.
Dora.
Sí, muchas gracias. Yo quisiera hacer la pregunta, en un principio tengo una pregunta para Dominique, para Jerónimo y para Edward. Is it okay if I ask in Spanish?
Yeah, claro.
Bueno, tengo una pregunta para ustedes y tengo una pregunta, más bien una solicitud para Chloe, and you can totally answer in English. A Chloe le quiero pedir, you touched on something and then you just went over something else. And I think it is very potent in your presentation, the idea that clay itself is a form of memory. And I would love you to expand on that. I would love it if you can expand on that. Y la otra para los demás que de alguna manera están tocando en esta especie como de las piezas convirtiéndose en nuevos archivos, pero apropiando archivos. Yo quería preguntarles, ¿qué opinan ustedes de la manera en la que la distancia temporal que implica ver estas piezas del pasado, el pasado novohispano, el pasado pues del siglo XX, afecta nuestra lectura del archivo? ¿Qué le hace al archivo esta mirada que está viendo la apropiación del artista, pero estamos viendo como en un long shot, a la distancia y una vista panorámica que el artista no tiene la posibilidad de ver cuando está produciendo la obra? Ninguno de los dos artistas de los cuales hablaron ustedes se podía sustraer del momento político y de la efervescencia social que estaba viviendo y no tenía esa ventaja que tienen ustedes como observadores de la situación y las condiciones de posibilidad. ¿Qué opinan ustedes? ¿Qué problema creen que eso puede presentar? Eso se extiende también a Dominique. ¿Cómo crees que afecta la forma en la que miramos, sobre todo con tantísimos siglos de distancia, entre el coleccionismo de estos primeros folios y su reproducción posterior en el siglo XIX? Gracias.
Voy a empezar como un poco más cerca del manuscrito. Es que en realidad no hay los nombres de los artistas, Biblioteca. Y creo que es una realidad de los manuscritos de la época lo más cerca de la conquista, pero también es una realidad porque hay nombres de los escritores, de los españoles, de los miembros de la audiencia. Entonces, creo que es empieza del manuscrito es una realidad del colonismo. Entonces, no es el nombre de los Biblioteca no es importante. Los nombres, sí, hay más que uno. Y también creo que por eso es un poco difícil porque evidente es una cosa colonial. Tiene este papel europeo, tintas de mesoamericano, también de Europa, y también es un poco diferente porque no es como los manuscritos prehispánicos, como son sagrados en lo mismo modo. Entonces era más como clérigo, ¿no? Para una visita. Por eso creo que era una idea quizás estoy pensando en eso, creo que en esto, que era una idea que era para los españoles, y por eso está mezclado de textos, y en realidad los españoles, especialmente de la audiencia en esa época, podían entender un poquito de náhuatl, entonces era una realidad también. Entonces creo que no es bien raro que está en España por esta idea, pero hay más manuscritos y cosas que estaban en Europa y vinieron aquí, y también porque las historias que tienen estos folios son de aquí, son de los nahuas. Y por eso creo que es un poco difícil, pero como se hace, como se guardan allá en la biblioteca, es un poco interesante también, porque están ahorita la pintura está en el departamento de Inquinúbila, y no es de Europa, y no es una imprenta. Y por eso, pero, ¿se saben? Yo hablé de la directora el verano pasado, saben que es muy preciosa, y saben que es un tesoro de la época conquista, se dice. Y más o menos por las pinturas, creo que tiene más valor. Y creo que es una mentalidad colonial, que las imágenes tienen valor, pero las personas que se hicieron no tienen valor. Y para mí es una parte de mi trabajo y todo, que esa es la cosita muy chiquita, pero es grandísima de toda la época colonial hasta ahorita, ¿no? Por eso es muy difícil, pero por eso yo necesito hacer yo hago una vista de colonial, porque son niveles de colonialismo. Creo que es sí, no sé, no hay una respuesta chiquita para eso, pero es que...
Thank you. Thank you for being decisive. I'm going to answer in English. The way that I would offer an answer is on the interlacing of archive and memory. And so one thing that I didn't really touch on in my talk, but that I showed at least one image of, is of the billboards that Alfredo produced of the Esos de Feliz. And the thing about those is they never happened, and they were produced as maquettes that were shown in the museum, and they were reproduced in interviews with the artist at the time. And in speaking with Alfredo about it, what he said is, you know, he'll go back to Chile and people will be like, hey, I remember those, they're so, and he's like, and I can't bring, I mean, he trucked in the fiction that they sort of happened in various ways, and didn't, if people assumed that they did, he didn't deny that fact at all, but is sort of loath to sort of pierce people's personal memories in relationship to this thing that actually was purely a fictional enterprise. And so I think that it's fascinating digging into the ways that the archive makes manifest certain elements of truth and falsehood relative to his own construction of this complex set of objects that he made. And, you know, he's given me access to a bunch of stuff. I've only been able to see like 90 minutes or so of footage related to the Obra Abierta piece. And yet he's on record as saying that there are hundreds of hours of footage because he recorded everything. And it's just in a storage facility someplace, apparently, that is difficult to get a hold of, which I believe. Like, he's been very forthright about a lot of other stuff that like is and isn't true. And so like, I don't, but I find it's just fascinating the degree to which a certain inflection of memory, even now, forces the archive in different ways, which I think is so powerful relative to the way that those documents get read against the sort of like cold eye of history, however true or false or biased it is, relative to the moment of production and the emotive and effective qualities that can be attached to that as it sort of lives in one's mind and space, which feels like the temporality of fiction, which was something that feels very different too. But anyway. Thank you.
Sí, yo solamente añadiría tal vez algo que es obvio, pero la distancia temporal en el trabajo con el archivo lo que hace, al menos en el caso de Óscar Muñoz, es que potencia la mirada afectiva, es decir, potencia la creación ficcional del pasado, ¿no? Y es interesante pensar en estas fotografías de archivo por contacto, que no está muy clara la fecha en la que se tomaron, ¿no? Muñoz las compra en el 70 y trabaja con ellas en el 2000, ¿no? Entonces hay hay una distancia temporal asumida por el artista en el proyecto que yo creo que es significativo y que justamente contribuye a eso, ¿no? Como a enfatizar la imposibilidad de ese archivo de dar cuenta de una realidad precisa a la que podemos acceder sin la ficción. Creo que eso es lo que está un poco planteado ahí. Y respecto a lo que dijiste de la respuesta a la urgencia del momento histórico, yo creo que una cosa que es importante ahí es que la respuesta a la urgencia del momento histórico por lo general carece de la humildad del no saber, ¿no? Es decir, hay una cosa en la respuesta a la crisis política que viene con una componente de certeza que el trabajo Muñoz, creo yo, está diluyendo en parte por su atención al tiempo, ¿no? Ya está como un carácter inaprensible del tiempo.
And the clay, which actually, as I was listening to Edward and Jeronimo's comments, I think is not such a different question after all, in terms of dealing with the authenticity or the distance that the archive creates or manipulates. So I think the comment that you are referencing in my presentation, that clay can carry this idea of primordial authenticity because it comes from the earth, and especially because the Atzompa potters are using the same clay sources, can actually, I think, reinforce the kind of logics that the organizers of the popular exposition in 1921 were really instantiating, which is that indigenous artisans, makers, artists are like a direct line of continuity to the past. And so it's a complicated question because I think, this even connects with the idea of replicas, and for the replicas in the Tamayo Museum, if these are fakes, was there a logic of thinking it's made from the same clay by the same ethnic communities? And here, I know for the Taller Coatlicue, that sense of continuity is very important, and I need to further elaborate the way that the materiality of the clay actually pushes back against the separation of time and space in Western cosmology, that for them, the sculpture unites space because it actually brings in the territory where the clay was mined, and also time because it's on a geological timescale and not a human timescale. So there's that consideration, but also I'm cognizant that I think it would not be true to the spirit of my work to sort of reify this idea that these artists are in sort of a direct line of continuity with the past. So I welcome further discussion on that and suggestions. Yes.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Luis y Gabriela, y creo que dejamos ahí. Bueno, adelante.
Es que mi pregunta funciona perfectamente para Chloe. So Chloe, this is like, I love your answer just now because it sets up my comment perfectly. I want to add on to what was just said about the fakes or forgeries. Virginia Fields, the former curator of Ancient Americas, would call these enduring modern traditions, which I love. But that is one aspect that could play in either perfectly into her, into Mariana Castillo de Valls' sort of questioning of the authenticity, but there's another layer to it because not only do they look pretty fake, some of them, but also they're not from Oaxaca at all. So the dog is a type from West Mexico. Yeah. The figure is from Veracruz. Looks really fake to me. And so the notion that those would have been made from that clay in Atzompa is also not there. So I mean, we can go and try to be, like, take this and like point out all the inauthenticities there, but I'm actually kind of curious to what degree that might have actually played into her choices or if that just like adds to her work rather than somehow detracts from it. And so, and then I think there's also sort of the fact that the artists chose the pieces that they want to replicate. So it's just like, maybe you can talk a little bit more about like how you interpret some of those layers, additional layers coming in.
Yes, thank you. So it is evident probably to many people in this room that I am a contemporary person approaching this. So I don't have the eye to distinguish fakes or authentic works. But yes, I did know that these are works from different regions or types from different regions. And for the Taller Coatlicue potters, that was not important. And that was precisely why they wanted to use the Museo Tamayo as a point of departure, as opposed to the Archaeological Museum at Monte Alban or another museum, because they're responding to, I think, the science of archaeology and anthropology as a colonial legacy of classification, and are wanting to assert that these are forms, ideas that belong to a Nahuac, as Adrian defines it, extending from Alaska to Nicaragua, that these are, this is common heritage. And so yes, it's not, I mean, their identity, I think, in Oaxaca has really been constructed by the market and by this, you know, the energy around the commercial industry of pottery in Oaxaca as unique to that space. And I still haven't really figured out how to kind of elaborate that aspect, but yes, there are the fact that they are forms from all different regions, that is known to Taller Coatlicue, certainly to Mariana, but they, I mean, the museum has records of where these objects are supposed to be from, but they didn't want to consult those. They wanted just the sort of, you know, Rufino Tamayo's aesthetic presentation without labels.
Hola, felicidades por el panel. Esto es un comentario, pregunta que intenta seguir con la idea de cómo nos aproximamos al archivo con la distancia y cómo podemos leer desde él y a veces quizá generar lecturas que son muy orgánicas en lo que encontramos o a veces muy distantes. Y voy a usar el caso de Jerónimo como un ejemplo, porque para mí metodológicamente lo que tú haces con Óscar Muñoz es algo que viene más de teoría literaria con una imposición de cierta lectura desde arriba, que no toma tanto en cuenta lo que el artista quiso decir. A diferencia, por ejemplo, de lo que vimos con Edward Vázquez, cuando hay mucho más, está más contextualizado el origen de mi propósito, digamos, político. No estoy diciendo que está ni bien ni mal, solo lo estoy pensando metodológicamente, porque justo en varias aproximaciones que he escuchado sobre el trabajo de Óscar Muñoz, incluidas otras series, como por ejemplo la de Aliento, que no la discutes acá, se habla más de una condición de espectralidad. Y tú tratas de hablar de esta falta de certeza, de realidad y distancia, que me parece interesante, pero me quedo preguntándome sobre cómo en esa sucesión de series o proyectos el propio artista va madurando una idea y encontrándose con el pasado, en este caso de Cali, pero también va enmendando las lecturas. Y tú al final nos propones algo mucho más general, donde creo que se pierde contextos específicos de producción. Pero quizás porque desde la historia del arte trabajamos muy cerca de tanto de los artistas como los contextos en los que se producen obras y luego cómo se les archiva y resguarda. De pronto pensaba más casi en la muerte del autor con Bar.
Sí, claro, gracias por esa pregunta. Bueno, yo soy, mi formación es literaria, entonces creo que eso explica mucha de esa lectura. Pero yo sí creo que hay en el trabajo de Muñoz, lo que pasa es que la recepción que ha tenido el trabajo de Muñoz, en parte posibilitada por sus intervenciones y por sus por sus manifestaciones públicas, ha tenido que ver con esta idea de, ¿no?, arte conectado con la historia violenta de Colombia específicamente, y con la manera como su producción sirve para memorializar, ¿no?, la realidad, el pasado violento, ¿no? Y claro, por supuesto, yo creo que está ahí, digamos, lo que yo estoy proponiendo no niega esa posibilidad de lectura, pero sí trata de trazar como otra línea de entender la producción, digamos, el desarrollo de su producción, ¿no? Empezando, digamos, con los autorretratos y terminando con la serie de interiores en carboncillo, los dibujos en carboncillo, y mirando más a las obras finales de la década del 2009, por ejemplo, ¿no? Del finales de la primera década del 2000, cómo hay un énfasis en la espectralidad, pero justamente la espectralidad como esa imposibilidad de aprender una realidad material completamente comprensible, ¿no? Y digamos que yo eso lo veo como con mucha más claridad en las obras autobiográficas, ¿no? Digamos, en las obras autobiográficas sí que me parece a mí que son una manera de usar la ficción para tematizar ya no el espectro, porque no está esos Cormuñoz produciendo su propia imagen autobiográfica, pero la imposibilidad de aprender esa totalidad de ese sujeto, de esa autobiografía, etcétera. Y ahí, conectado con eso, hay una cosa que es muy interesante y que yo no mencioné, y es la presencia de la mano, de la mano del artista en las obras, ¿no? En los dibujos está la mano, en las fotos de juego de probabilidades está a la mano. Y yo creo que hay también como un comentario sobre la materialidad, es decir, hay una cosa con la materialidad del cuerpo que es incuestionable, ¿no? Y que está conectada con las otras obras que son, digamos, de más referencia política e histórica. Pero sí, no puedo negar mi literariedad.
Muy bien, tenemos la última pregunta y sí, Gabriela. Y les pido brevedad para que alcancemos a ir al tour.
Gracias por el panel. Mi pregunta es para Chloe. Maybe you prefer that I speak in English.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I was thinking on this issue of how these contemporary ethnic groups construct their identity. And they, I think, from my experience in Peru, that they take from many different sources, and they are not thinking on like maybe anthropology or archaeology, that this needs to be tied to an ancient past, or this is fake, this is not, this is from this region, this is not from the region that my culture comes from, but they take from many different sources to construct a contemporary ethnic identity that I think that is the idea that I was having while listening to all these interventions regarding that. And my question is about authorship, because I was looking at the work that you presented, and while the artist is working in a very interesting way, asking them to represent these new versions of these objects from the past, present. Then when she makes this installation, I see that it's only her name that appears there. Mm-hmm. So this is a way of continuing coloniality. So while the whole project is trying not to decolonize something, at the end it is exerting coloniality again. And I have seen that in many contemporary artists working with indigenous rural artists, that they are not acknowledging that. So I don't know your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much for first that suggestion of how to approach kind of a new reformation of an ethnic identity that was really systemically erased. And so that's why people have to kind of reformulate their own new contemporary indigeneity now. That is very helpful. Thank you. And in terms of, yes, the lack of credit and the question of authorship, this is really a driving question of, I'm in the very early stages of my dissertation, but this idea of artists using collective labor and kind of the dematerialized model of social praxis and a conceptual model for their own praxis as researchers who are using the archive. then treating kind of indigenous communities of artisans as a potential archive to mine, I think is something that happens in many different artist practices, and that we in the academy really need to address. And I struggle with how to deal with this, because in conversation, the artist Mariana, the curators say, well, yes, of course, it was a complete collaboration. It's really important that we give credit, but I had to work very hard to even assemble a list of the names of the participants. They're printed very small in the catalog. It's like, and it's really not, it doesn't distinguish between other kind of ancillary informants and people who really were vital to the project, including when the work was shown here at MUAC. It would just said Tairquatlique Atompa. So I don't want to villainize artists who are doing collaborative work and dealing with this legacy. But also I do think, it's a question that really needs to be unpacked. Yeah, so I would also welcome further discussion if you have suggestions of how to manage, or if it just needs to be a really hard line of this isn't acceptable. Yeah.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias todas, todos. Fantástico, aprendimos creo que todos muchísimo. Los invitamos entonces, para finalizar, tenemos las visitas guiadas por las exposiciones que están en este momento en el MUAC. Tenemos 3 visitas guiadas por la exposición de Francis Alice, Juegos de Niños, la otra visita guiada a la exposición Gala por Raskim, Entre lapsos de historias, y la tercera, Giro gráfico, como en el muro La Hiedra, y van a empezar en breve estas visitas en unos 15-20 minutos. Entonces las invitamos a que se queden si quieren para esas visitas, y les recordamos que mañana tendremos otro día lleno de ponencias súper interesantes, que el día de mañana vamos a estar en la sala Francisco de la Maza del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas aquí en la UNAM. Entonces, pues, mil gracias. Sí, perdón. Sí, exacto. Y tenemos el cóctel. Sí, y tenemos el cóctel. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Wonderful talks. I kept thinking about the